say a prayer for the Christians in Syria. They sure do need it. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. If you're not following what has taken place in Syria for political reasons the last couple of weeks, then you should be following it at the very least, or the very most, whichever way you want to look at it, for religious and spiritual reasons, because there is an active, thriving Christian community in Syria that is a bit on edge right now because of what's taken place the last couple of weeks with the ousting of Bashar al-Assad and the institution of Ahmed al-Sharia, a de facto leader of a radical Islamic group called HTS. And before I get into more of that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at Real Life Network, at washingtontimes.com, and of course, wherever podcasts are available. If you do go to washingtontimes.com to check out my podcasts, go ahead and go to the newsletter section. It's on the bottom of washingtontimes.com. Click on it, and you will find a page filled with all the newsletter products that the Washington Times puts out. You can subscribe to Bold and Blunt there. You will get not only my podcast, but also the commentaries that I write for the Washington Times, as well as my video versions of Bold and Blunt that I do periodically, delivered right to your email box 3 times a week. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday are the days. All you have to do is enter your email address, and you'll be subscribed. And like I said, check out the other Washington Times newsletters and products that are put out. They're really great. They really are informative, and they should be a go-to opening your email box every morning to see what's out there. The Washington Times really does a good job of keeping you informed. But let me talk a little bit more about Syria and what's going on there. And BBC conducted an interview with this de facto leader who promised that the country of Syria has been exhausted by war, torn by war, and that it is his intent to uphold rights and freedoms. They don't want Syria to become like Afghanistan, where American troops withdrew and Taliban officials promised to uphold the rights of religion and the rights of women and then did not. So this new leader, this de facto leader, is promising that no, it won't become another Afghanistan, that rights will be respected. So BBC did this interview, and I'm just going to play it because it's about 3 minutes long, but it's very informative. Here we go.
The de facto leader of Syria, Ahmed al-Sharia, chose to do the interview in the presidential palace built by the Assads. He told me he wasn't surprised that the old regime collapsed so quickly. Syrians, he said, needed to keep calm to tackle all the problems they face. You've made a lot of promises. You said that you'll respect the mosaic of different sectarian groups here in Syria, minorities as well. Are you going to keep those promises?
The Syrian population has lived together for thousands of years. We're going to discuss all of it. We're going to have dialogue and make sure everyone is represented.
See, that's such a duck and dodge right there, right? It really is a yes or no question. Are you going to respect the freedoms and rights of Syrians? Yes or no? So simple, so simple. Didn't happen. Here we go.
The old regime always played on sectarian divisions, but we won't. We were welcomed in all the big cities by all the sects. I think the revolution can contain everybody.
So this isn't going to be some kind of a caliphate, or you're not going to make Syria into a country like Afghanistan, because you know that there are people who say that maybe you want to behave like the Taliban.
Yeah, I'm going to go on record and say I'm one of those people. So we'll see what pans out. But You can mark me down in that group. I think that that's what's going to happen. Here we go.
There are many differences between Syria and the Taliban. The way we govern is different. Afghanistan is a tribal community. Syria is completely different. The people just don't think in the same way. The Syrian government and the ruling system will be in line with Syria's history and culture.
So the culture of Syria includes rights for women, it includes education for women, it includes tolerance for people drinking alcohol. Is that all acceptable to you?
When it comes to women's education, of course. We've had universities in Idlib for more than 8 years. I think the percentage of women in universities is more than 60%.
And alcohol?
There are many things I just don't have the right to talk about because they are legal issues. There will be a Syrian committee of legal experts to write a constitution. They will decide, and any ruler or president will have to follow the law.
Let's talk about wider issues that you face. First of all, this country is broken. There is massive amount of destruction. The economy is destroyed. There are huge debts. How do you begin to start dealing with all of that when the country's under sanctions and when major...
See, I think this is what it's all about right now. The de facto leadership in Syria truly wants to get sanctions lifted. And so they're going to say all the right things. They're going to pretend to keep an open mind about rights and religion and women's rights and things like that they know that matter to most in the world. And they're going to pretend that they are not going to institute some sort of Islamic-based crackdown on freedoms because they want sanctions lifted. So reading from this BBC piece that goes along with the video, the piece is entitled, "Syria Not a Threat to the World," the rebel leader tells BBC. And it was posted just recently. It was posted just this week. Let me read from this. The de facto leader of Syria has said the country is exhausted by war and is not a threat to its neighbors or to the West. In an interview with the BBC in Damascus, he called for sanctions on Syria to be lifted. This is what it's all about, right? Here's the quote. Now, after all that has happened, sanctions must be lifted because they were targeted at the old regime. The victim and the oppressor should not be treated in the same way. So this rebel force claims to be the victim here in this latest happenings in Syria and this ouster of Assad. And the Assad government was the oppressor. So they're basically trying to get the world to recognize their regime as victims. And as part of that recognition, they want sanctions immediately lifted because there's an economic issue that's taking place in Syria that is devastating the population. Well, a lot in Syria don't buy that line of logic that this new regime is going to uphold rights, individual rights, and respect freedoms, particularly religious freedoms, and particularly the right of Christians to worship freely in this new world of Syria. And Christians in Syria are on edge right now, rightly so. My guest today has been watching with growing alarm about what's taken place in Syria in the last couple of weeks, and more than that, the uncertainty that this new regime brings to the ability of Christians to continue to worship in Syria in this new reality. And so without further ado, his name is Rusty Reno. Thank you, Rusty, for being on Bold and Blunt. It is so great to have you here.
Oh, I'm glad to be with you.
So you, as editor of First Things magazine, have been watching with great interest the fall and ouster of Assad from Syria, with concern about the state of Christians. What's going on with the Christian community right now in Syria?
Well, I think that they are extremely anxious. Al-Jolani, the head of the group, the coalition that overthrew the government there, says that religious minorities will be protected, but the track record of Islamic militants in the Middle East is not good. So I think the Christians in Syria are on edge, and justly so.
So let's look historically at Christians in Syria. Do we have a head count on how many historically have been in Syria, so we can compare contrast then and now?
Well, I think that a dozen years ago or more, it was before. Syria was embroiled in a civil war for an extended period of time, as you know. Until Assad regained control with Russian help. But I think, a dozen years ago or 2 decades ago, there were more than 2 million Christians in Syria. And I think when I looked at some stats on this, there are presently about 500,000. So we've already seen a dramatic reduction as Christians have fled the country in search of a safer place to practice our faith.
And where do they normally end up? Do you know that?
I don't know what the destination of choice is. That's a great question. But typically, patterns like this, people tend to go where their relatives are. So they have some support network. And I'm sure many would like to come to the United States. In fact, I think one thing is that I wish that the U.S. government would accord refugee status to Middle Eastern Christians broadly. Certainly, after the Iraq War, the Christian population of Iraq, fell precipitously as people fled for safer places.
So to your knowledge, is this something that the incoming administration is considering? Because under the first Trump administration, Mike Pompeo was very good at watching out for Christian communities and religious freedom in general around the world.
I would think that Senator Rubio, who's been nominated for Secretary of State, would share the same concerns that Mike Pompeo did. I don't know whom the administration, I don't think they've announced whom they want to nominate as ambassador for religious freedom. That's a kind of an important position to be spokesman against religious persecution, especially persecution of Christians. So I do think that this incoming administration will be have a strong voice. I think there's every reason to hope that will be the case.
So are you in contact with Christians on the ground right now in Syria?
No, I don't have contacts in the Middle East. We have writers for our magazine who have on-the-ground experience there that I visited with and chatted with. A friend of mine, Father Benedict Keeley, started an organization called Nazarene.org, which is a Catholic organization that provides relief, support, and advocacy for persecuted Middle Eastern Christians. He got his organization started in the aftermath of the Iraq War to try to provide support and protection for Iraqi Christians. But his interests and his organization is also concerned now, of course, with Syria.
I was reading headlines this morning, and as I understood it, just a couple days ago, Christians held their first Mass since Assad's fall, just a couple days ago. And as you say, though, the new interim government can't be trusted to uphold the rights of Christians still. So this is being seen as hope, as optimistic, but at the same time cautious optimism. Is that correct?
Yes. In that coalition, there are radical Islamic factions that would like to, that are connected with the ISIS organization. So yeah, I can't imagine, being living in Aleppo as a Syrian Christian, not thinking like, whoa, this could turn out very badly for us. It's hard. People want to remain in their homeland. Christians have been in Syria since the first century of the Christian era. These are foundational communities of the Christian movement, the way of Christ in the first century. And it would be a great tragedy if the Christian community in Syria were effectively came to an end. Sadly, this happened with the Jewish community in Syria. I mean, Aleppo was a place where Jews had lived from before the time of Christ and had a vibrant and storied tradition. But after the independence of the State of Israel, persecution, pogroms, attacks. So really, by the time you get to 1960 or so, there really are no Jews left in Aleppo. I just fear that same thing's going to happen to Christians.
And I wonder if Christians right now in Syria are looking to Afghanistan as an example, right, where Taliban forces, after America withdrew from there, promised that the likes of religious freedoms and women's rights in particular would be upheld. And under the radical Islamic control there now, all those promises have been broken.
Indeed, hence I think the what I would call guarded pessimism of the Christian community in Syria. That is to say, it's not certain that things are going to be terrible, but they certainly could be, given the track record of Islamic militancy throughout the Middle East.
So you say your magazine has journalists there now?
No, we're not. We don't do reporting, in all fairness. But we've, Father Keeley's written for us, and others who visit. But I don't have anybody there at the present moment.
So, insofar as going forward, is there any kind of, I don't know. What do you see going forward in the coming weeks? Is it largely dependent on what happens in the White House?
No, I think largely it depends what happens on the ground in Syria. I mean, will al-Jilani, the head of the now ruling coalition, will he follow through on his promises to protect minority rights? It's an open question.
And the United Nations, how much influence do you see they hold in terms of upholding Christian rights in Syria?
Oh gosh, I don't think anybody looks to the United Nations for effective intervention. Sadly, yeah. No, and I think we'll see what the incoming administration, as we already mentioned. We'll see whether or not the administration tries to use some of its influence in order to get the best outcome for Christians in Syria. I'm guardedly pessimistic myself with respect to how much the U.S. government can do, given the fact that the al-Jilani rebels have complete control of the country. Assad fled. It's a done deal. So how much influence can we have? I don't know.
Do you see any role here where Israel might have any type of influence with calming tensions or ratcheting up tensions, either indirectly or directly, impacting Christians then in Syria?
I think that the Israeli government, it took immediate action after the fall of the Assad government to degrade the military capacities of that country, so that the incoming regime doesn't have the full force of arms that the Assad government did. I think that Jerusalem's taking a kind of wait and see approach, just as I think the whole world is with respect to this new this new regime in Syria. Neither I think taking any kind of aggressive action, but also very much on its guard. We just don't know what direction that Syria is going to take.
Talk to me just in the last couple minutes about your magazine, what you guys cover there, and how people might be able to take a look at what your coverage is all about.
We look at we take the long view. So history. We've published, for instance, material on Syria's history in the past, because this was coming up during their own civil war in the 20 teens. So we look at the past, we look at history, and we try to think about the theological and spiritual foundations or bases of the events that are in the headlines. So we do a kind of deep dive into the theological and religious foundations and motivations that so often animate us and are important factors in human affairs, especially in a place like the Middle East. It's a religion-saturated part of the world.
And how can people access it online?
ForEarthings.com. We have a monthly magazine. You can read it online or subscribe in print, but we also have fresh material every day.
Rusty Reno, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak on this issue on Bold and Blunt. Not a very Merry Christmas for some Christians at this time, so hopefully things will improve quickly for them. I appreciate your time. Thank you, Rusty.
All right, thanks for having me on the podcast.
And that's another Bold and Blunt. Remember, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at Real Life Network, at washingtontimes.com, and of course, wherever podcasts are available. Say a prayer for Christians in Syria right now. And don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.